Thank you very much, guys, and I'm going to try to breeze through this because much of what I was starting off with has been covered far better with our previous speakers. But just to touch on my own background, I have been in the business for a very long time in terms of marketing communications. Started in advertising, did my own marketing consulting firm back in the 80s and 90s, and for most of the past 20 years I've been at a company called Landor, which we're going to talk about in some depth in a few minutes. Past 12 of those was both creating and then ultimately serving as their chief marketing officer on managing the Landor brand really around the globe, as well as being a senior lead on a number of B2B and nonprofit branding projects. Now I'm back in my own business since last summer, doing many of the same kinds of things, only on a somewhat smaller scale, working for smaller audiences. So looking at my own background, again, not to belabor this, but these are a number of the clients that I've worked on. Many of these are both B2B and B2C. There's a crossover in that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the rules of B2C and B2B because the previous speakers, Alyssa in particular, spent a lot of time talking about this. I think the rules are pretty straightforward there. So I'm going to move on to some of the differences in talking about B2B. And these are fairly general, but I think they might be worth noting. Clearly in the consumer world, we tend to talk to very large multiple target groups that you've just heard from both John and Alyssa. In the United States, this is a very broad, highly demographically diverse country, and so it really does require a great deal of thought in terms of how you go after multiple target groups. That often results in some fairly simplistic messaging unless you really segment in. It's an expensive proposition to go to most consumer audiences in this country, and one of the ways many organizations are getting around that is through increasing use of social media. The virtues of B2B, of course, are you have very generally smaller and more tightly targeted markets, and very often these are in the tens of thousands as opposed to even the hundreds of thousands. It's a high-end purchase decision usually, and very often a features-driven messaging situation where you have, very often as we've just seen, some very technical details that have to be communicated. And these communications are often directed at third parties as opposed to the end user. And in my opinion, and you're generally talking to a very informed and sophisticated customer base, they may not be sophisticated marketers, but they certainly know their own product well, and therefore your pitch has to be fairly sophisticated and very knowledgeable in whatever area you're trying to go after. The brand building tools are similar in B2B versus the U.S. Again, we've just talked about these in greater depth than I'm showing here, so I'm not going to belabor this other than one of the things that was not discussed much and which I'm a huge believer in, and you will see in the case study that I'm about to present, I believe that public relations is an essential tool to any successful marketing exercise, probably anywhere, but certainly in the U.S. And I'll show you how we did that for Landor, which is my topic of the day. The first point to be made is that most of you probably never heard about Landor, and we are, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of background. It is one of the leading brand strategy and design firms in the world. It's a very small universe of companies that do that. There are probably only 5 or 6, 7 maybe that actually do the kind of work that Landor does, which is create global brands. If you've seen a FedEx truck or a BP truck or station or anything related to BP, a Smirnoff bottle or Cathay Pacific logo, Landor did it. And it's a company that does work all over the world. We have a 75-year history. It was started by German immigrants, so it wasn't who landed in San Francisco. There are about 750 employees, 24 offices, 19 countries, and we are a division of WPP, which, as most of you may know, is one of the largest marketing communications conglomerates based in the UK. And in fact, the CEO and her staff, senior staff, are Brits and located in London. So it is a very international organization, and we have to appeal across all kinds of geographies and people. Our target audience, however, was, when I was there, a very select group of people. It's CEOs, CMOs, corporate communications directors, and really senior marketing and branding executives of Fortune 1000 companies. A typical sale, if you will, for a Landor project, which would be a consulting project very often resulting in design work of some kind, is $200,000 to $300,000 plus. And many times, if you're rebranding an airline or something, a major corporation, it's going to run into the multiple millions. So it's a very considered purchase. It's also a purchase that most clients don't even think about until they actually need it. And it's usually some kind of a sea change experience, such as an M&A activity of some kind, or maybe a new CEO or CMO that wants to make a significant change in the company. So it's not something that you can just knock on doors and say, how about a new logo? It really does require them to be aware of a company like Landor when they are in need of its kind of services. Those kind of companies we would talk to besides the Fortune 1000s, of course, are a lot of nonprofits and industry thought leaders. We also would deal with our own WPP partners who have other agencies. So we, again, had to make sure that we were out there seen as a superior brand, being at the forefront of our industry. The services we provided are listed here: brand assessment, positioning, corporate naming, corporate and product design, brand experience design, and then internal brand actions and engagement. All of these, again, fairly expensive services that are targeted to a very high-end customer. The tools of choice: we had a very rich client base. Some 15 plus years was in our database that we began back before really anyone else had thought to do this in our industry, to our knowledge. And it built to about 16,000 people by the time I left last year. Landor.com, a major window of opportunity for us. It is our core selling proposition. And it is the place we go and we invite our customers to go to make sure that they understand what Landor does. Thought leadership is exceedingly important. Again, this is the way that a company like Landor is able to communicate to its high-end audience that they are at the forefront of thinking in the branding industry, which is very important. That does include collateral and published articles and white papers, plus a lot of online thinking and actions. Public relations, I mentioned earlier, and then, of course, conferences and speaking engagements and social media. I'll just take you through what some of these look like. The website itself was designed about 3 or 4 years ago to be highly interactive, and we made the decision at the time that we were going to make it really almost a magazine of sorts, and that every month it gets updated. This happens to be the one, I think, for February. It is refreshed with a new story. There's always a theme. In this case, the future of packaging is the theme. There will be case studies. If you look across here, these would rotate so that there would be new stories and case studies that relate to the future of packaging, probably a story about a new kind of innovative packaging, maybe a white paper, things that relate to the overarching theme. And then if one goes to any one of these, they're all very live. And so you can touch on a case study here or reach a Landor person here. The point of all this is that it's meant to be a window into what Landor thinks and how it works and what we have to offer. And we were concerned about getting traffic to this because, as we know, unless you have some kind of a hook, it's very difficult to get people to come and find you. So we hit upon the idea of doing a monthly outreach piece, which is we call it there. It was called On Deck, and I know Alyssa commented that newsletters and emails probably are not so effective anymore, and we were cautious about that. But in this case, they're nicely designed, and they go out to all 16,000 of the people in the database. It speaks to whatever the theme of the month is. It's very graphically interesting. It's not long. It lists 3 or 4 different items that are going to be featured on the website in a given month. You click on any one of them, it leads you right to one of these sections. If you click on a packaging story, it would take you right to this story, but of course you're now in the website. we noticed when we started doing this a significant bump in web traffic every time we sent one of these out at the beginning of the month, and that, to my knowledge, continues to this day. It turned out to be a very good exercise, and people were able to opt out if they wanted, but very few did. And people actually enjoyed being a part of it. We also did get involved in collateral. About 10 years ago, we produced a massive book, a hardcover edition of the Landor history, plus our featured client stories at the time. We did it in 8 languages, 3 different editions. It was a monumental undertaking. It took over a year to produce this thing, and not a few gray hairs, at the cost of about $750,000. And at the time we did that, we said we'll probably never do this again, and that turned out to be true. That's more than the entire budget that Landor uses for its marketing these days. So those were nice days, but then along came 2008, and we had to get much smarter about how we spent our money. So in the process of doing that, we decided that intellectual capital was really important. So these are examples of articles that we started to produce on the right here that are oriented towards specific topics. One is about brand purpose, the other is about launching a brand and lessons to be learned from that. These were placed in this case, they went in a pay-to-play publication, which is a very common thing to do, that was targeted towards marketers. The important thing isn't how many people actually see your article in a particular publication, because the odds are that it'll be very few or relatively few. What's important is what you do with those stories. So we would republish them, put them on Landor.com, feature them in the send out on deck, and then we'd of course send them out selectively to individual clients who we thought would have interest in them. And so they were heavily merchandised. Perspectives was an idea that one of my team came up with in about 10 years ago. And it's a compendium that is produced annually that collects every bit of all of the best articles and white papers that Landor employees around the world have put together. And it's sent out about this time every year. This is the one from last year. There should be a new one coming out soon. It's now done in iBook format because we know the importance of doing those things digitally, and it gets a lot of great downloads. But there's also the thunk value, we call it, of having a 70, 80-page document that you can send physically to clients and prospects, or put in the room when you walk in, or if you're in a pitch, have it sitting on the desk as the client walks in. And this gets a lot of great response from people, and it's been a very successful piece for Landor for the last number of years. It isn't really collateral. It's not a selling piece. It's a thought piece. And we also do the occasional, what we call a Slim Jim, a fact sheet, which I know Alyssa referenced. These are necessary in terms of just here's what's going on now, but we don't invest, or Landor didn't at the time, invest a great deal of money in that, because that's what the website is supposed to do. Moving forward, public relations I've talked about. These are just examples. This is some old stuff that I did, but the point of this is that we hired a professional brand public relations firm. I didn't try to do this as a trade-out. To me, it was important that we had the best of class thinking, and we tried to make sure that we had a broad spectrum of people from Landor featured as either being interviewed or commenting on things, or sometimes publishing articles, so that Landor's intellectual horsepower was at the forefront. And of course we would always try to get these into verticals, but they could be, it didn't really matter, again, because of the idea of repurposing whatever we did. Conferences and speaking engagements are also extremely important. For a number of years we co-sponsored a marketing conference, a 2-day marketing conference with The Economist. We did this because alignment with that brand was very important. It was international. It was a consumer and corporately oriented business-to-business publication, as you know. It had many of the same attributes of high intellectual capacity and thought-provoking articles that we wanted to communicate as our own brand. And this worked very well. It was very expensive. Ultimately, it became, they chose not to do it anymore, but it was an opportunity for us to have great speakers who we would merchandise and also get to know and work with, not to mention all the clients and the schmooze opportunity. Conferences are a terrific way to do that. Again, it's what you did with them. We would always write a paper on who was there and what they said so that we could send that out and try to leverage all of the contacts and the information there. And then, of course, we try to take an opportunity at every occasion to speak wherever possible, and I'm clearly doing that to this day because here I am. Lastly, social media. We do use a LinkedIn page. There's a Facebook page for Landor, but the LinkedIn page is really for Landor alumni, which is a very fruitful group of people who are off doing, many of them are clients now or prospects, and so we decided a couple of years ago that it would be good to mine them and give them a place on Facebook, or rather on LinkedIn, where they could collect and share information. And we obviously, Landor feeds in what's going on the web page, as you'll see here, but there's a great deal of conversation that goes on back and forth, and I have a feeling it results in business. And there's also blogging and tweeting of all the articles and things that it produces. So that, in a nutshell, is a very simplistic approach to how Landor does this. If you actually want to read more about what Landor does, there's an article that I wrote that goes into a great deal of depth that you can get to on my website. What do we learn from all this? You can do a lot with small dedicated teams and not a lot of budget if you're very focused on clearly defined objectives and audiences, as you've heard earlier. It does require active involvement of whoever is on the ground where you're doing the marketing. You can't just run this from a central location remotely, because you must be able to both hear what's going on in the rest of the world and feed them information as it relates to them. And so we spent a lot of time back in the day in Landor. I assume they still do. Once or twice a week, or once every 2 weeks, excuse me, we would have a global call with all the marketing people around the world to make sure that we're all on the same page and tracking new business initiatives, etc. Your CEO must be fully engaged behind any successful marketing plan, and that's certainly going to be true in the U.S. The clients want to see senior leadership involved in whatever project or on a professional services type of organization or service. They want to see the CEO involved. Social media has become a major tool, highly efficient. It's the only way that Landor was able to increase its visibility with reduced budgets, quite honestly. And collateral and brochure material is still used and needed in print form, but it has to be done selectively. It's expensive to do, and it has important but limited application amongst today's customers. I don't think most of them want to be inundated with print materials. Most of it gets thrown away. But if it's the right story to the right person, then it matters.